Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. In a region long associated with manufacturing-led growth, the services sector is quietly but significantly transforming economies in East Asia and the Pacific. Now, according to a newly released report by the World Bank, services are now contributing more to labor productivity growth than manufacturing, with exports and foreign direct investments in services outpacing traditional goods industries. Now, in Malaysia, this shift could redefine the way we think about economic development, about digital innovation, and even gender equality in the workplace. But the question is Malaysia doing enough to harness this momentum? And how prepared are we to navigate the challenges of reform and competition in this space? So today on the show to discuss this further, I have with me World Bank East Asia and Pacific Chief Economist, Dr. Aditya Mattu. Aditya, thank you so much for being on the show with me. What an interesting report this is, and I'm hoping we can begin by looking a little bit more closely at this shift that's happening in the East Asian Pacific region, the shift from manufacturing to services as the main driver of growth. Can you talk a little bit more about this, why this is happening, and what you're seeing as the most interesting trends or insights from this transformation?
Melissa, you already summarized the essence of these trends, but let me spell them out a little bit more. You know, for a long time, people saw manufacturing as the driver of productivity. But as you noted, over the last decade in this region, East Asia and Pacific, where manufacturing has been the hero of every story, much of the productivity growth is in fact driven by the services sector. That's transport, communications, finance, education, health, tourism. And, for a long time, people thought services were not tradable. But now, thanks to digitization, trade in services is in fact growing faster. Exports of many countries, including Malaysia, of services are growing faster than the exports of goods. And finally, much of the development in the region was driven by foreign investment in manufacturing. But what we see that foreign investment in services in some countries is growing 5 times faster. In Malaysia, maybe twice as fast as foreign investment in manufacturing. And as a consequence today in the region, half of economic output, GDP, originates in the services sectors. And in Malaysia, for example, 60% of the people have jobs in the services sector. So how can services performance not matter for development in the future? Now, in terms of why, I think there are 2 insights that we obtained from an analysis in the report. First is the role of digitization. For example, in Philippines, the adoption of new types of data analytics and software are leading to productivity growth every year on average by about 1.5%. And it's the services firms that are adopting these new technologies much faster than manufacturing firms. So that's the first driver, digitization. The second big driver is the reforms that have been implemented. They're still incomplete, but they're significant. Now, Vietnam, for example, is a country on acceding to the World Trade Organization. It committed to phase out a lot of restrictions in services that it maintained. It had lots of public monopolies in finance, telecom, transport, and it pre-committed to phase them out over a period, say, between 2008 and 2016. And what we see is the significant growth in productivity and quality of services in that period. And it's about 3% every year. But the interesting fact is that you saw an even bigger productivity growth in manufacturing in the sectors which were using those services. So the power of services reform and digitization is that the benefits are not just limited to productivity growth within the sectors that reform or are digitized, they're passed on to users. Some of them are people like you and me, Melissa, who use those services, who get better finance, WhatsApp, all these wonderful new ways of moving, communicating, paying, traveling, living, but also other firms in the economy.
Right.
They benefit a lot.
Aditya, could I get you to elaborate? Maybe give us some specific examples. How has digital technologies shaped this, or digitalization changed this? Can you give us some examples of how we as users have benefited from it through the changes through the services sector and the manufacturing sector? It has trickled down to us.
I think that's a important question, and roughly I'd say three types of changes. One is how services are traded. Melissa, when you used to go to school, you had a teacher and you were face to face in a classroom. When you were a business and you wanted your accounts done or designs made, they were all sitting in the same building or the same factory. So digitization has made distant communication, distant delivery possible. So you're no longer trapped by the local supplier, and the local supplier is not limited by the local consumer. In a way, the world has become everybody's, I forget what the expression is, not oyster. I think that's not right. But anyway, so that's the first. Take a company in Vietnam called FPT. Now, FPT employs 8,000 engineers. Its annual revenues are $2 billion. Now, when you think of Vietnam, you think of mobile phones. But FPT actually exports software services to 30 countries around the world. And that's, suddenly all over the world, people have the benefit of software deliverers, producers from the whole world rather than just what their local market produces. And for the firms, they can exploit the economies of scale that come from serving the global market. That's one dimension, which is really about trade. But you also see every day the transformation in domestic markets and services, the digital platforms which are changing, for example, how you move, Uber, Grab, how you communicate, WhatsApp, how you pay, FinTech, the Ant Group, how you, travel and stay, Airbnb. So this whole new phenomena of digital platforms has, again, you see how much it has made it easy for you to travel safely, how much it is easy for you to, venture funds are, available globally. And similarly, the brilliance of the communication that you and I are benefiting from at this very minute is the product of these new technologies that have become available. And final point, if I'd make, is, and that's how these technologies will change how services are produced. And that's where you have, everything from robots to artificial intelligence, which are changing the nature of work, or what types of skills are needed. And that, in a way, is really what we as economists care about. First, how are all these changes contributing to productivity, which improves the quality of services that you and I get, the prices we pay, and at the same time, what is it doing to jobs? What kind is it going to create jobs or destroy jobs? Is it going to change the skills we need? So those are the other transformations that we are interested in, and we begin to analyze in this report.
Right. Can you help us think that through, how it might change jobs and skills and the dynamics of the labor market in the region, or more specifically, you focus on Malaysia, how do you think it might change the labor market here?
I think those are the issues which profoundly concern both people who need jobs and governments who realize that that is politically, going to be one of the biggest issues. And again, in the simplest terms, these technologies are going to change the demand for labor, what kind of workers firms need. It's going to change the supply of labor in terms of what kind of capacities human beings can have and acquire. And finally, it's going to change how matches are made. How do firms and workers find each other? So in terms of the first is a little bit complicated, a little arcane, but it's going to change what we call the task content of jobs, what people actually do. So you see, in a factory, for example, if I'm I get a robot, the robot is able to do some of the things that people did. Similarly, if I'm in a firm or an office and I get hold of new artificial intelligence technologies, it's going to change what human skills I need. Now, in some cases, it's simply going to displace. If you're a mechanical worker who's just taking money out, counting it out, and giving it to somebody, the ATM has made you redundant. There are other tasks, mechanical accounting, basic calculations, and other things. Even computers had already threatened those jobs, but artificial intelligence is like all that on steroids. It's going to move to what you call not just things that you did with your brain in a routine mechanical way, like counting money, but also non-routine cognitive stuff, where you need to make judgments, and that's where I think there's a second category of workers, like a financial analyst or a doctor or a teacher. Part of what they do will be taken over by AI. But a lot of what they do, which is exercise judgment, express sympathy, concerns, and, make broad strategic decisions, interact with each other as you and I are doing, that will not be displaced. So that class of workers, only some of whose jobs are taken over by AI, will become empowered. They'll become even more productive. And then there's a third category of workers who will actually create and feed these technologies. They are the software engineers, the algorithm producers, and so on. Now, you might say that that displacement is like a Damocles sword that is going to threaten some people and they lose. But there's the other benefit, is the productivity boost, that people will simply be able to do much more. And when they're more productive, prices of services fall. And if consumers are sensitive to those prices, they start consuming more. That means the scale of production increases. So that means even if you need fewer workers, you'll, per every unit of service or for every car you make, if your scale of production increases a lot, there'll be many more jobs. So that's really the way that the demand for work will change. In some ways, it can hurt workers, but broadly, people are optimistic when they look back and say, always, technology made candle makers and chariot or horse car drivers redundant, but other things happened which created new things. But the transition can be painful. But the other thing is, of course, that how you cope with the transition depends on how people acquire the skills. And technology is also making it possible for people to become more skilled. And whether it's through digital education or acquiring digital finance, which enables them to engage more productively, to equip themselves to take advantage of these changing opportunities. And finally, there's stuff like LinkedIn, which enables people to make matches. So you don't have to go searching door to door. You find a better match between what a firm needs and what a worker needs. And that also is good for the economy. So these are really three ways in which we are going to see the labor market changing.
Well, I'm very curious to find out more about how we can make that transition as fair and just and as painless as possible. But one of the things that really struck me about the report, which I hadn't considered before, was the fact that the services sector tends to employ relatively more women, and it does, and more so as the level of development increases. Why is that, Aditya? Why is it that services tend to have a higher female to male employment ratio, and how do we leverage this or improve on the gains that are made and leverage the momentum so we see more gender equality in the workplace, the workforce?
Again, another, I think, socially and economically important question, Melissa, and that's absolutely true. Labor force participation in a country like Malaysia is low because only a little over half the women work. Labor force participation of men is 80%. Women, less than 60%. And even, it's not just whether they get jobs, they get paid less when they get jobs, as much as 15% less. Now, why? I hope that's not true in your case, though. But I was going to say that is an economic cost. Can you imagine if more And you see, there's another interesting puzzle. There are not big gaps in education, but there are big gaps between men and women in whether they work and the returns they get at work. So I think it is a problem, but the good news is, whereas in, say, the manufacturing sector, for every 10 men, there are 4 women, in the services sectors, for every 10 men, there are 6 women. And that ratio, as you said, tends to increase as development happens. Now, the why it's happening and what can be done, I think, is a combination of social, policy, and market failures. Social is the norms that we have, what is expected from women, especially, in aging societies. Women are expected not just to look after children, but also after the elderly. Then there is a World Bank publication which you can look at called Women, Business and the Law. I think that's what it's called. And if you look at Malaysia, unfortunately, I was quite struck that a country as on the verge of becoming a high-income country, and where I see dynamic people, dynamic women like you everywhere, that there are laws which effectively are an impediment to workforce participation. If there's sexual discrimination, I think there is a law against it, but there's no punishment. There are laws about, for example, your right to go out and do things by yourself, how much control you have over assets. So you see, there is, before you start thinking of doing good, you have to stop doing harm. So laws that either de jure or de facto discriminate against women are obviously not just socially undesirable, but the country pays an economic price for those kinds of laws. And the final point is that the market also is actually imperfect. Women don't necessarily have access to credit. And again, here, there's need for proactive policy, not at credit in the same way that a sort of a male entrepreneur would have. And similarly, there's a huge, why isn't there a better market for care? And that market for care where you would have high quality, well-regulated childcare. Malaysia has done really well in terms of early childhood education, but there is big inequality in the quality of that care. So that also traps women who care about how their children are brought up and so on. And as I said, it's not just going to be about children. Just as a woman has stopped looking after her children, she has to start looking after her in-laws or her parents. So I think better markets for care can liberate more talented, skilled women into the economy. And that also leads, with these new LinkedIn and everything, to better matches between skills and employment. So this is really must be an important part of Malaysia's reform, social reform, policy reform agenda.
On that note, what other policy reforms would you like to see Malaysia prioritize or look more closely into, particularly if we want to avoid this the painful transition as you talked about, and also on the bright side, to look at the opportunities to unlock the full potential of what the services sector can bring to the economy?
So I think, we talk about these positive developments, the new technologies, the partial reform already having produced benefit. But I think, Melissa, one of the main contributions of our report is a framework which shows how services reform can create both new economic opportunities by getting rid of all sorts of barriers, and also equip people to take advantage of these opportunities by using digital services to learn, to be healthier, to access finance. And it's that interplay between improved economic opportunities and enhanced human capacities which could generate this virtuous cycle, which could power Malaysia's transition to high and even higher income status. Now, what inhibits this? First of all, it's a puzzle. This region, which has benefited enormously from openness to trade and investment in manufacturing, is still suspicious of openness in services. There are lots of innovation inhibiting barriers. Foreign firms in finance, insurance, in transport, in communication still face restrictions on ownership. There are economic needs tests, which means discretion on whether we really need new foreign providers or not. So licensing is not opaque, it is opaque, it's not, it's not objective. And finally, there are also lots of restrictions on cross-border delivery of transport, finance, and the flow of data itself is impeded by, like in Malaysia, lots of stringent controls. Now, some of these controls are legitimate, but some of these controls are purely protectionist in many countries. So I think that getting rid of those restrictions is really a priority, but at the same time, it can't be done mechanically. We have learned that, just mechanically opening out financial markets, for example, risks instability. Mechanically saying, I'm going to let all data flows happen, makes consumers vulnerable to cybercrime, to abuse of privacy. So this new world requires new regulation. We were always worried about monopolies. We were always worried about abuse of information. But now you got bigger and bigger concentration. You have these platforms which become the single intermediary between producers and consumers. And how do we know that they won't charge you too much after first inducing you to become a part of that whole network? How do we know that they won't exploit workers? Because the workers will not have many other options. So that monopoly problem you need to worry about. You also need to worry about data flows and, that you want the data to flow within countries across boundaries, but you want that data to be respected. And that's finally an important challenge, that in this world, you can't do everything within the confines of your own country. You want to get the benefits of international trade, international data flows, and that will require international cooperation. Because you want privacy to be respected, you want protection against cybersecurity, especially when your data travels across a boundary, but you want that to be achieved without fragmenting the global market. And that's why countries need to work together to protect not just their own consumers, but consumers in other countries which rely on their service providers. So that's really important.
Okay, so those are big considerations, I think, for policymakers, going forward. But what should the workforce take from the trends laid out in this report? You talked a little bit about preparing Malaysia's workforce for the future, for the current and the future. What would it be in terms of making sure that we meet the skills and the demands of a digitalized services economy?
Melissa, creating and retaining skills is a huge challenge for Malaysia. This is a country on the verge of high income status. 4 out of 10 children in Malaysia are not able to understand an age-appropriate text and respond questions at the age of 10. That's at the bottom end. At the top end, one story you hear all the time is about how smart Malaysians run away to Singapore. So this, I told you that this is an era where you want this virtuous cycle between opportunity and human capacity. You want this to play out within the country. You don't want to create skills only for the rest of the world. There's nothing wrong with immigration. But then you have to ask yourself why are there such weaknesses at the base of this pyramid? And why is there an exodus at the top of the pyramid? And I think one big, broad point I'd like to make is Malaysia has done remarkably well. There are few countries which have avoided the natural resource curse and made a brilliant transition from commodities to manufacturing. But the policies that helped that first transition are now becoming an impediment to the next transition, where Malaysia, walks on 2 legs: innovative manufacturing and new modern services. And for both those, human capital is crucial. Human skills are crucial. And I think that's what people have to recognize, that the foundational skills have to be strong, and they're not always the case. And at the same time, the more advanced skills have to be relevant. And that we need to really rethink what are the capacities that individuals need to have to not be at the mercy of these new technologies and risk being made redundant, but to work with these new technologies. And that, is a really crucial question for Malaysia. It's a crucial question for the whole world. We are struggling with those questions. But I think just one simple point, Malaysia, as I said, has done really well on early childhood education, but there are big inequalities in quality. I think thinking about how Malaysia can meet its legitimate equity goals to help people who are relatively backward without putting in place policies that inhibit growth. I think that is the central challenge for Malaysia.
Aditya, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. That was Dr. Aditya Mathu from the World Bank. That wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.